By the summer of 1943, Germany was in a bruising state on the Eastern Front. Defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad and the failure of Operation Barbarossa had left Hitler's war efforts severely weakened. Yet, in July of that year, the Nazis were able to amass nearly 800,000 troops and thousands of tanks to launch yet another offensive to the east. Standing in their way, nearly 2 million Soviet troops with over 3,500 tanks. What followed was a fierce month-and-a-half-long battle, now generally considered to be the largest in the history of warfare, the Battle of Kursk. I'm James Hanson. This is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different historical battle, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Kursk, Germany's last strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, yet much like those which came before it, failed in the face of Soviet resistance. What would a Nazi victory here have looked like? And would it have actually made any difference to the war? That's a question for our experts, and joining me, as always, is the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel, the historian, author and broadcaster John Trigg. Welcome to you both. Now, before we get into the events of the Battle of Kursk itself, we should just set the scene. Obviously, this is the summer of 1943. We've got our big map of continental Europe in front of us. Few key things to point out. First of all, Kursk itself. And the significance of Kursk is it's right on the border of Ukraine and Russia. And of course, Kursk is very topical now in 2024 because that's where the Ukrainians are launching an offensive into Russian territory now as part of the war in Ukraine. Obviously, 1943 is the year of the end of Stalingrad as well. So the Germans had been defeated at Stalingrad back in the start of 1943. And then one other thing to point out on this big map, which is relevant to what we're going to come on to a bit later on, and that is Sicily, because during the Battle of Kursk, the Allies launched their invasion of Sicily. Dr. Chris Parry, I want to start with you. Give us a sense of how the war is going at this point.
Well, it depends on your perspective, of course. For once, the Germans are really on the back foot. What has just happened in May, because we're talking about July, is the German and Italian forces in Tunisia have surrendered in the face of the attack of the Allies coming across Africa here. And as you've said, invading Sicily on the 10th of July. In the Eastern Front here, you've got a 1,000-mile front here from Leningrad right down to the Black Sea here, which the Germans basically are still on the offensive. They haven't been forced into the sort of defensive lines that we're talking about. What's happening here, though, is the Russians are building up lots of armies, particularly tank armies, to be able to not only hold the Germans, but also to conduct offensives if they get a breakthrough. Now, classically, the Russians have only attacked in winter successfully. They haven't really attacked in the summer because the Germans are quite good at that. They get their aviation up, they get their armour moving, and they combine the two very well indeed with their infantry. But along this line here, you've got a salient. It's 100 miles from east to west and about 150 miles from north to south. And salients are always very tempting for generals because if you attack them at the base, you can encircle the troops that are within them, and it's a perfect way of annihilating the enemy opposite. And there's a very tempting target here. We now know there were 9 Soviet infantry armies there and 2 tank armies just to the east of it. And the Germans think there's a proportion of these troops inside that salient. So if you can actually cut that salient off at the base on both sides, not only do you stabilise your own front, you maintain the initiative, and you say to your allies and friends, we're still being successful here, we've still got momentum in the east, and of course you rock back the Russians, who are really quite pleased with themselves because they've obviously taken out a German army for the first time at Stalingrad. And they're looking to the south in Ukraine, where von Manstein, who's one of the Germans' talented generals, has actually pushed up very hard through Kharkov, again, achieved astonishing success. What in fact happens is is that Hitler and his generals, some of whom were a bit sceptical, say, look, this is a great opportunity. And it's an exposed salient, and we'll take it out, and it'll rock back the Russians for the rest of this year. They won't attack us for the rest of 1943 because they're not good in the summer. The worst we're going to have to face is the winter. On early part of the year, Hitler says, right, 13th of March, that's when we're going to do it. But what happens is they can't get the tanks, they can't get the logistics sorted out in time. Hitler himself is very nervous. He says to his generals, I've got a really bad feeling in my stomach about this.
With good reason, you might say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And he keeps putting it off until July, where he's got many more Tiger and Panther tanks into the battle. The Tigers are the big, heavy, armoured tanks, which are really proof against Russian anti-tank weapons. Panthers, medium tanks, but highly mobile. And also they've got some Panzerjäger, 88mm tank-killing vehicles. They're almost artillery. And he wants those to come up to the front. They know what the Tigers can do. They're great against T-34s. The only snag is T-34s, the Russian equivalent, are quite good in the summer. They've got broad tracks and they're able to get through the sort of terrain where Kursk is at the moment. So everybody's set up. We can talk about how the battle goes itself, but the Germans are really quite chipper about this. They think they're going to win. You look at the diaries of some of the soldiers, they think, well, this is really going to change everything for us.
We'll come on to the battle itself in a moment. John, to bring you in, is Hitler right to think, look, we've got to do something? We've got to regain the initiative somehow?
Completely, James. Well, thanks for having me on again. And at that stage, we can't underestimate what a disaster, not just in military terms, but political and morale for the German nation that Stalingrad was. It was a seismic shock for that defeat. And at that point, February 1943, the entire southern Russian front for the Germans was just in chaos. And then, as Chris alluded to, Manstein had pulled off, what was called the miracle of Kharkov at the time, from Feb to March, where the Soviet advance had been nipped in the bud, sent fleeing back, and that formed the Kursk salient. And what Hitler wanted to do was go back to business as usual, which was beating the Russians, and this was his opportunity. And Manstein was all for let's just keep on, let's keep fluid, let's keep moving. This is what we're good at. We're not good at static warfare. We're good at maneuver warfare. So let's use what we've got and just keep on hitting the Russians, and we'll have another Kharkov and another and keep on being victorious. Hitler was very nervous. He was a nervous commander throughout most of the war. I mean, look at his refusal to send the panzers into Dunkirk back in 40. So he was always concerned that he was going to get caught napping. But this was his opportunity, he thought, to, as Chris outlined extremely well, to deal the Russians a huge blow in the summer of 43 and in effect secure the whole of the Eastern Front for the rest of that year until an expected Soviet counteroffensive in the winter.
Well, on that note, let's look at what really happened with the Battle of Kursk. Let's zoom in now and look at the battlefield itself. OK, as you can see, we've got a new map in front of us now. Before we get into the battle itself, let's just go through some of the statistics. The Germans committed over 780,000 soldiers with nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns. This was backed up by over 2,000 aircraft and nearly 10,000 artillery pieces. Their total casualties stand at 200,000. The Soviets had nearly 2 million men at their disposal and more firepower too, with over 5,000 tanks and assault guns. More than 2,700 aircraft in the sky supported over 25,000 artillery pieces on the ground. And casualty estimates do vary widely, but range up to 800,000. OK, here we are with our new map. This shows the kind of lay of the land for the Battle of Kursk. And as you can see, the key thing is this salient that, Chris, you were describing a moment ago, a bulge, if you like. And so you can see how, the Germans are thinking, if we can just kind of snip off the salient here from the north and the south, then that puts us in a really, really advantageous position. We should just note the red you can see on the map. We'll come on to that a bit later on because that's the Soviet counteroffensive. And of course, crucially, you've got Kursk here and you've got Prokhorovka as well, which is crucial just here. So Dr. Chris Parry, I mean, it's a massive battle and there are lots of battles within it, notably Prokhorovka, but if you can, do your best, sum up the events.
OK, so the key thing about this is the Russians know it's coming. They know from intercepts that the British have provided that it's going to happen. They're picking up concentrations of aircraft, lots of aircraft. The Germans have got 2,000 aircraft committed to this battle, and they can see the build-up of the logistics going on to the west. They've also got information from John Cairncross, who is their Lucy spy in London at the time, one of the British spies that gives information to the Russians. And they send up quite a lot of reconnaissance flights, so they're mapping what is going on all the time here. They don't understand, though, why the assault hasn't happened in March. And Zhukov says to Stalin, look, we're not going to attack them early. Let's wait till they attack us. We'll absorb the shock. We've got lots of people now, and then we'll go on the counterattack. And so what they do is they've got nine infantry-based armies here, 2 tank armies, but the critical thing is they have the steppe front, as they call it, which is a huge reserve of tanks and also vehicles, aircraft and personnel ready to counterattack once they've absorbed the German shock here. Now, what's really critical about what they do in terms of preparation, and it just gets better for them the more the Germans delay through from March till July, is they build a series of trench lines. Every soldier has to build 5 meters of trench every night for those 3 months, basically between the edge of the salient and Kursk itself. They've got 10 to 15 anti-tank guns per kilometre sighted here, along with heavy artillery that is covering these river crossings that mostly go, as you can see, from east to west. More importantly, every square kilometre has 1,600 mines in it, which is 4 times what they had before Leningrad and Moscow. But interestingly enough today, that is the density they've got in southern Ukraine. To stop the Ukrainians coming through. Wow. So, you know, that comes forward to today. Now, the German plan is for Army Group Centre under von Klug to send the 9th Army under Walter Model in to attack the north of the salient. And in the south, you've got Manstein, this very successful general, sending in the 4th Army under Hermann Hoth, and also Group Kempf, which unusually isn't called the 8th Army, it's called Group Kempf, after its general. So they're going to go in here, and the idea is that they're going to use, obviously their normal sort of panzer tactics to try and break through the Russian defences, and as we've said, snip off the salient from north to south. Now, interestingly enough, the 4th Army's got a new tactic that they're using. They're going to use their Tiger tanks to punch holes in the Russian defences to allow the less capable tanks, other armour, and the Panthers to come through as well. And part of the reason that Hitler delays is he wants his Tigers and he wants his Panthers. But unfortunately, during the battle, the serviceability of the Panthers isn't that great. They're new, they haven't been broken in most cases, so that slightly lets them down. But you're going to see classic blitzkrieg tactics here. You're going to see, particularly in the south, aviation mixed with panzer grenadiers, Tiger tanks, and in the north, the same, but less tanks in the north, to tell you the truth. Now, I think what's really important about this, a lot of the confidence that the Germans get is from these Tiger tanks. Yeah. Because if you see in the battle, they take on their Russian opposite numbers and they knock large numbers of them out, because their armour's better, the sighting mechanisms are better in their guns. And the Russians complain all the time that their anti-tank guns just can't penetrate the Tiger armour. And we see a lot of cases where the imbalances are great, and you get a 3-to-1 attrition from the German side onto the Russian side throughout the battle. The other thing that's worth mentioning is a thing called a Panzerjäger. Tiger, the Panzerjäger, essentially it's a heavy 88mm gun. They later were called Elephants, but in fact they're Ferdinands. they are exceptional at knocking out tanks, and they have a number of these, and they distinguish themselves. There's over 100 of them in punching through. But we shouldn't underestimate the engineering challenge of getting through these Russian obstacles.
Well, John Trigg, just to bring you in on that, because Chris makes a really good point about the Tigers and the tanks. I mean, this was probably the most intense tank battle of all time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that, James. I mean, 70% of Germany's armour in the east was concentrated for this battle in what is, and you can see from the map, a very constricted space. This wasn't a battle fought in the hundreds of miles and so on. This was a battle fought over, tens of miles, if that, and to cram as much armour from both sides. I mean, the sheer number is incredible into such a small area was going to lead to a battle of incredible intensity. And for the Germans, as Chris alluded to, this was a real challenge. Firstly, they were trying to coordinate two army groups. So Army Group Centre, obviously from the north with Model's 9th Army, and then the 4th Panzer and Army Detachment Kemp from the south, from Manstein's Army Group South. So the question always begs, who was actually in charge of the whole situation? And the truth is compromise. And the Soviets, again, as Chris rightly pointed out, they maintain this doctrine to the day. Their defence in depth doctrine is just immense. I mean, we're talking about 3 vast concentric lines of defence, over 1 million mines, over 6,000 miles of trenches had been dug, literally thousands of machine gun nests and anti-tank guns, as Chris pointed out, sited extremely well, so that the Germans weren't going to have to break through, one defensive line or even two. We're talking about mile after mile of some of the densest defensive fronts in the war.
And I think it's worth mentioning, there's a lot of aviation involved here. The Russians have brought nearly 3,000 aircraft to the fight. Indeed, they try and actually get the Germans on the ground on day one. On the day of the offensive, July the 5th, they arrive to find the Germans have already taken off, and the Stukas and other bombers are already out doing their business against the Russian defences. But the battles in the first days of this are some of the greatest in the war. And quite a lot of pilots on both sides become aces 10 times over in shooting down aircraft. I mean, we always talk about the Battle of Britain, we always talk about bombing over Germany, but we've got to bear in mind that the aerial battles here, not just in terms of providing ground support for the land forces, but also in the air itself, are incredibly intense as well. So as a ground-air combat, this is almost at the level of how we envisaged the Cold War was going to be. John?
Yeah, completely agree with that. It's the issue about air power in the east was always the sheer space involved. In the west, the fronts were always so constricted that the same number of aircraft could bring very intense battles to bear. In the east, the space was just so vast, and the Germans by now had shipped a large number of their aircraft back home to defend against Anglo-American bombing raids, and so they had less than 40% of their air force in the east, and they had to bring it all together. Literally, the rest of the front line, there was scarce an aircraft available. Everything had been shipped to Kursk, and on that first day, I think by some measures, it's the largest day of aerial combat in the war up till then. I mean, the Soviets were caught completely, as Chris said. I mean, they lost 776 aircraft that day, whereas the Germans lost 26. That's it. And the German fighter force were able to, I mean, they were, by that stage of the war, so many of the German fighter force were just aerial killing machines. And their ability to wipe out large numbers of Soviet aircraft, throughout each day was just vast. I mean, people, German pilots knocking 6, 7, 8 Soviet aircraft out of the sky per day was seen as nothing particularly special.
One of the German pilots fighting here at Kursk is an ace. He has 352 kills.
Wow.
He's got the record, basically.
That's incredible.
So, yeah, that's the scale that we're talking about here.
So Chris, I suppose the crucial question, talk me through how the Battle of Kursk was won and lost.
Okay, so let's start in the north. Very simply, Walter Modell's Ninth Army starts coming through this area here. They come up against a slightly different terrain to the south. And the key feature up here is a thing called Hill 272, which they capture 3 times. But the Russians recapture it each time. And they're held up quite significantly fighting against Rokossovsky, who's a famous Russian general, as we know. But the key point is here that the Russians are able to flood reserves in very quickly to be able to actually channel the German attack, but then to also contain it. And you can see all the rivers and the other topographical features actually get in the way here. The Russians also have this steppe front under Konev. Now, this is really important. This is a huge number of men and quite a lot of armour too, nearly sort of over 1,200 tanks here, ready to plug any gaps in the south. Now, Manstein sends in the 4th Army and Group Kempf in the south, and they're pretty successful. There's slightly different tactics here. As I mentioned earlier, the Tiger tanks are used to punch through so that everybody else can flood through any gaps they make. The German engineers do a great job of deconstructing the Russian defences. And you end up in a situation where 2 Panzer Corps arrives in the vicinity of Prokhorovka, getting nicely through, about 20 miles into the salient, as you can see, and getting round the back of Kursk. And at this point, they find that their flanks are exposed. The 7th Corps to their left hasn't actually kept up. And so they are quite vulnerable to counterattack. And at this point, the steppe front under Konev is deployed to actually counter them. And there is a huge battle between 5th Guards Tank Army and also 2 Panzer Corps at Prokhorovka. And it's probably the most famous part of the battle itself because they fight themselves to a standstill, basically. And I say a standstill because it's not a defeat for the Germans here. They just pause. They're exhausted by this time. Quite a lot of the German troops, by the way, are on drugs to keep them awake during this attack. Of course, they're exhausted because they've been rolling through for quite some time. But by the time we get to about the 12th of July, that's about a week into the campaign, the Germans have got to Prokhorovka. They're fighting it out with the Russians, about 350 tanks against about 800 here. It is the classic defining bit of the battle itself. And then news comes in of what's happening in Sicily and Italy. There's also a threat down to the south in the Donetsk area to German forces there. And Hitler starts thinking, we might have a bit of a problem. I've got all these forces committed to Kursk. It's not going as quickly or as well as we wanted it to, and we've got threats emerging elsewhere. Now, should I redeploy some of my forces?
And he does.
And he does. And he essentially takes forces away from Manstein's troops in the south here and starts redeploying them down to basically defend other positions that were being attacked by Russians to the south and southwest.
John, do you want to just finish off the story for us? Tell us how the Battle of Kursk ends.
Chris has encapsulated it extremely well. I mean, come the 12th of July, particularly down in the south, Manstein's ready to go again. As Chris said, it wasn't a German defeat at Prokhorovka, it was a Czech. They were exhausted. I think the point on the drugs is a very good one. They were using a drug called Pervitin, which is an amphetamine. And the Germans used it a heck of a lot during the Second World War. They were literally on speed. But they were ready to go again, and Manstein felt that they were on the verge of victory. And so when Hitler decided to cancel the offensive and go on to the defensive, redeploy troops to the west to counter the Anglo-American landings in Sicily and to face off the Russian counteroffensive down in Donetsk. This was a shock to Manstein. He said it was a huge mistake, but that's what he was ordered to do. And so the line kind of solidified, but at the same time, the Germans were out of position. They were having to reorganize. They were losing vast numbers of their troops and armor. And of course, that encouraged the Soviets to use their reserves, which were vast, to launch counteroffensives that would literally last for the next month and send the Germans back to pretty much where they started from at the beginning of the Kursk offensive.
It's worth bearing in mind that at the point of decision, there was a whole Panzer Corps ready and waiting, 3 divisions ready to reinforce this attack on Prokhorovka, the 24th, and that wasn't committed. And as you see, as John says, as they started turning away, the Germans never, ever got on the offensive again.
Yeah. Well, this was the last strategic offensive on the Eastern Front by the Germans.
Absolutely. And from then on. And what's really interesting, if you look at the casualties, the Germans inflicted 3 times as many casualties in armour, artillery, aircraft and personnel on the Russians than they inflicted on themselves. And as soon as the Germans start retreating, it's them that take the casualties. So the Germans are really good at absorbing casualties when they're attacking, but when they're on the defensive, they obviously take quite a lot of casualties. And as we hinted, the result of what has happened here is that the Russians then attack, and you can see with the red lines what they call the Oral salient, because that itself is now a salient. They also attack the Belgorod salient, and they drive down through Ukraine. They recapture Kharkov, they capture Kiev. And of course, the Germans are seriously on the run. They have to abandon the Crimea, and it's all downhill, if you forgive the pun, back to Germany after that.
Well, there we go. Those are the events of the Battle of Kursk of 1943. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, now let's ask ourselves, first of all, could the Germans have won the Battle of Kursk? John Trigg, to start with you. I mean, this was a winnable battle, was it not?
It most definitely was. And for me, there's 2 points here. Firstly, Manstein wanted to go really from mid-March onwards, and that was the first day. He said, "Don't wait. Let's not wait. Let's not wait for the Tigers. Let's not wait for the Panthers. Let's go now while the Soviets are reeling after the defeat at Kharkov, and we'll just keep on punching, and keep them off balance. Maneuver warfare. This is what we're good at." And there was what he wanted to do was to carry out an attack straight away from the north of the salient, get Model's army to cut down, and that was a golden opportunity to win the battle, by April. And then during the actual battle itself, as Chris rightly pointed out, the stalemate at Prokhorovka was just that. It's that you've got another Panzer Corps ready to go, and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was still functioning. They were in command of the battlefield, so controversy surrounds Panzer casualties at the time, but the Germans were able to recover most of their damaged armour, repair it, and go it again. So, German irretrievable losses were estimated to only be about a dozen Panzers from that attack, whereas the Soviets, of course, lost several hundred. So they had the equipment to keep going, and if they carried that on, then they were literally through the third belt of defences, and they could have driven possibly to Kursk and won the battle, and put potentially 9 up to 11 Soviet armies in the bag, and that's a quarter of the Red Army.
That's really interesting. I mean, Chris, presumably you agree with that, because if you go earlier, you don't allow the Soviets the chance to build up the defences that they do. And then you also agree that once you get to Prokhorovka, OK, it's a stalemate, but go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think going earlier was also problematic. It wasn't just about waiting for Tigers and also waiting for the new Panthers, the medium tanks. There's a lot of logistics involved as well. My big question about Kursk is, once you've closed the salient, what are you going to do then?
Yeah.
Is it just a question of stabilising the front, which I think was part of the objective? What you are going to do is you're going to probably encircle Vatutin, Rokossovsky's troops here. You've still got quite a lot outside the salient.
Yeah.
So they could attack while you're still trying to recover. You're trying to actually put your own defensive positions in place here. And my question throughout this is, what was the point of this? I mean, I think it looks very attractive. You see that, it's just begging to be bitten off. And to a German, as you said, John, the encirclement temptation was huge. But it's a tactical victory.
But it just tie these things up a bit, no more. I mean, that's basically what it is.
It is. It's smoothing the front. And I worry about what's going on here, because the industrial production of the Russians at this stage is huge. They're producing vast amounts of material. They're generating a lot of manpower. You've still got quite a lot of stuff. Unless you can enclose these other armies that are here waiting to back up, then you're going to be in quite a difficult position. And then, of course, you've got the other distractions down in Sicily, southern Italy, down in the Donbass region. You think maybe there might be another front opening, which became D-Day later, of course. But, I mean, I think the critical thing, James and John, is that if they had won it, the incentivization for Stalin to say, you know what, we need to start talking here.
Well, that's very interesting, and we'll come back to that in a bit. We should mention, John, as well, that the Russians were on to the Germans. I mean, they had intelligence that this is what they were planning. If that wasn't the case, how does that change the battle?
It would have been incredibly challenging for the Red Army without the intelligence that Chris talked about earlier, all the stuff from Cairncross, Bletchley Park, and so on, as well as all of the intercepts that they were getting direct, because that enabled them to focus their resources at the key point. Having said that, one look at the map, I mean, look at it, look at that bulge, and this enormous, fat stomach pushing into the German lines. It would be an obvious one for the Germans to go. Particularly the Soviets understood German doctrine, and the German army was fixated on the whole canaille principle, which was to pull off, just as Hannibal did against the Romans, this enormous encirclement battle. And German generals were licking their lips looking at Kursk, because they were saying, with the numbers of Soviet troops involved, if we encircle not even all of the Soviet forces, we're looking at something bigger than Kiev back in 1941, and that was 665,000 Soviet troops that they captured. This would have been larger, and for any German general, that is just too tempting a plum to pick.
There's something else here, John, I think, is what I find interesting about this is, given German sort of doctrine, is this direct approach, even though it's a blitzkrieg approach, this direct approach. The temptation for me as a German general, having seen everything I've seen in the East, would have been to go wider, rather than going, Kursk is like a honeypot. But in fact, if Model in the north and Hoth in the south had actually gone wider and encircled to the east, you not only would have knocked out the reserves, you'd have actually been in the rear of most of the assault forces. So if you'd have had a fixing action here against the main Russian forces and encircled wider and used your aviation more intelligently, you could have done this encirclement. That's the key point here.
Yeah, Chris, I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. So for me, this using of both Army Group Centre and Army Group South with no overall command was a huge error. And Model, for all his qualities, was not a manoeuvre general.
He wasn't an attacking general. He's the fireman, isn't he? He's Hitler's fireman.
Absolutely. And so for me, it's Model and the 9th Army and Army Group Centre. It's a holding action. Yeah. Fix the Soviet forces in front of them, infantry heavy attacks and so on. And your armour, that's what you give Manstein. And you give Army Detachment Kempf, and you give the 4th Panzer Army, you give them everything you've got. And yes, you send them east. Do what Guderian did at Kiev in 41, which was a huge flanking manoeuvre that the Soviets didn't even know where it was for most of the time. And it was absolutely massive. And that was take the risk to your flanks. And that's what gave you the victory at Kursk, and that is what could at Kiev, and that's what could have worked at Kursk. And you're right. But don't go the short way; go the long way round.
That was always the German neurosis, though. Whether you look at Normandy, Battle of the Bulge, all that sort of thing, they're always neurotic about their flanks. And of course, that's what happens in the original Barbarossa attack. It was originally going to be through the Baltics and through Ukraine. And Halder says, no, we're going to get attacked in the flanks. We need to go through the centre as well. And constantly, you've got this worry about your flanks in German doctrine, which, as you say, John, bedevils the advantages of some of their really lightning strike actions with their panzers.
And John, do you agree with Chris that, okay, even if the Germans win, does it really change anything? Is it a prize worth having? Because, okay, you win Kursk, where next?
It doesn't win the war. As simple as that. But what it does give the Germans is if they succeed, is time. And at this stage of the war, when they're under attack, from the south, from the west, over in the skies, and from the east, is they need time. They need to be able to shift the forces they've got available from one front to the next to try and win victories in each place. And a victory at Kursk would give them at least the summer and the autumn of 43 to be able to move their forces kind of elsewhere. And as Chris alluded to, it would give the Soviets pause for thought, and of course a wipeout of 15-20% of the Red Army. It would be replaced, but then they would look to do a winter counteroffensive. And again, would it have the force, the very power that they've been able to bring in the 41 winter counteroffensive, or 42? Probably not. And of course, then they're looking to build up to the great summer of 44. And then we get on to questions of, would a German swing towards the west would have put the Allies off D-Day?
Well, hold that thought, because we will come back to that in due course when we consider the wider consequence of the Battle of Kursk. I mean, just to finish off, Chris, how the battle itself could have been fought differently. I'm guessing you're basically saying Manstein was right, Hitler was wrong.
There's quite a lot of discussion going on between German generals and Hitler during the course of the preparation of this, and also during the battle itself. Germany is distracted, as John says, by quite a lot of things that are going on at the moment. Where is the real threat to us right now? They're saying, well, actually, Italy is a lot closer than Kursk is. The key point about Kursk, in my view, if you look at the letters home from the troops and you look at some of the staff interaction here in German, they're saying, we want to get them back for Stalingrad. Seriously.
It's a morale thing.
Yeah, this is not just a tactical issue, it's a psychological issue.
Yeah.
If we can smash the Russians here, and look, it looks like Stalingrad. We'll encircle,
yes, it does.
Encircle all these Russians and do to them what they did to us at Stalingrad. So there's a psychological element here. But the fact of life is, Kursk of itself is not significant. And the issue of who wins and who loses is down to what happens afterwards. And as we alluded to afterwards, the Russians were able to step off this around the Bulge in both directions in order to attack and go through. And it's catastrophic for the Germans in Ukraine, because it leads to the fall of Kharkov, Kiev by the end of the year in November. And essentially, Germany has lost that huge industrial and agricultural base that is so precious to Hitler himself in political terms, in hanging on to it. So it's catastrophic in that sense. Of course, had the Germans been able to stabilise the front here and hold it, they could have gone, we'll just hold off the Russians, because we know they're not great at attacking in summer. They've just proved that. Okay, we can redeploy internally. And let's not forget, at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were able to take 2 panzer armies west, away from this front, even when they were doing worse. So they're able to redeploy on internal lines. It looks ambitious, but they actually achieve it, as they do in Italy just after this. So we shouldn't underestimate the German ability to operate on internal lines. The real lesson from Kursk, though, and it's the lesson from a lot of these battles, is that you actually have to get your moving parts moving at a time and place when you need them. Both sides here lose control of their moving parts, and it's only by luck rather than judgment that certain things happen. Look in the West, same thing happens. It's only when Eisenhower has real control of the moving parts, including the really bolshy ones like Montgomery, that actually things go right. But you shouldn't underestimate the pressure on the human brain of actually coordinating all of this. And John's point is absolutely right. Von Kluge and Manstein say to Hitler, before we start this, who's actually in charge? And everybody knows it's Hitler, really, but nobody really wants to say it should be somebody else.
Well, this has been genuinely fascinating, because I think what this has proven is that the Battle of Kursk could have been won by the Germans. And on that note, let's do what we really love doing on History Undone and examine some of the long-term consequences that could have stemmed from a German victory at Kursk. OK, big long-term consequences had the Germans won at the Battle of Kursk. John, start with you. I mean, we're kind of saying, OK, they've secured their eastern front for the time being at least. How does that affect the rest of the war?
The big one would what's going to happen in the the West, and how is the West going to react to such a German victory and such a big Soviet defeat? D-Day was obviously what everyone in terms of the Anglo-Americans were focusing on for June 44, and would that have changed the time? No, I don't believe that would have done. In fact, Stalin would have been pushing very heavily for it because he would have wanted some relief for the Eastern Front. But it's about the capacity of the Red Army to do what it later did in the war, and specifically around its summer 1944 offensive, which always gets overshadowed by the success of D-Day, understandably. But of course, Operation Bagration then destroyed German Army Group Center. It was one of the largest Soviet victories and biggest German defeats of the war, and allowed the Soviets to go all the way to the very gates of Warsaw. And on that basis, on the beginning of August, there was the Warsaw Uprising. So, big question: would that have happened, or would that have been delayed, or even happened at all? And would the West, the Anglo-Americans, been able to, after a successful landing in Normandy, then push on and get to Germany while the Red Army was still in Ukraine and Belarus, rather than knocking on the door of Germany?
Well, does D-Day even happen when it does, Chris Parry?
There's a couple of things here. I think if the Russians get stalled here in the centre, they're starting to think about the flanks. We've got to remember, during Kursk, there's already probing quite in strength here down in the south and southwest. So you're probably seeing an offensive coming here. And you've got Romania, the source of Germany's oil, and also a close ally, is going to be very vulnerable. So I would have seen a Russian attack, Soviet attack, go through that way. And also, we're seeing the end of the Leningrad siege as well.
Yes.
So instead of actually going through the centre, you might have seen essentially Barbarossa, as originally envisaged, in reverse from the Russians. So they go through the flanks. So there's a distinct possibility about that. There's something else going on in 1943. The Russians are probing to see if the Germans want an armistice. Even while Kursk is going on, they're going through the Swedes to Goebbels, and they're going to von Ribbentrop and saying, look, what about an armistice? So if Kursk actually is a German victory, you end up with that being reinforced. Now, the Allies know this is going on, because they know from ultra intercepts that these discussions are taking place through the Swedes. So what is your attitude to D-Day at that point? Do you think that Stalin is bluffing about having an armistice and a separate peace in the East with the Germans? Because he'd want quite a lot of that territory back.
Yeah.
And Hitler's absolutely neurotic about maintaining Ukraine if he can, with all the industrial and agricultural materials there. So is Stalin bluffing to make sure D-Day does happen on time, or does he really mean it? Because if you've got a separate peace in the East, the Americans and the UK have got to refocus their strategy. I would say that D-Day doesn't happen, and the accent then goes on the Mediterranean. You reinforce in Italy. The Churchill plan for going to Greece actually then comes into fruition.
Yeah.
And the whole front, if you like, is turned round.
So the Allies would have to liberate France from the east?
From the south.
From the south,
Because, as you know, eventually there was a landing in the south of France later on. And I think the whole of D-Day, given the fact that we occupy North Africa, we're already in Italy, you'd have seen the whole of the assault probably focused on the Mediterranean, knocking Italy out and going up through the south. And what we would have seen, I think, is a defensive line at the Alps and also through this area here. But I think it would have led to a total reorientation. But that's only on the basis that they've got an armistice here in the East and they've got the basis for negotiation.
That's a fascinating what if, though. John, your thoughts on that?
I think Chris was probably right. And the other interesting point coming out of that would have been, obviously, the Mediterranean first was very much Churchill.
Yeah.
That's what he wanted from the start. The Americans were never keen. And so, what would have happened to the American view of the war? Because they'd agreed a Germany first policy. But if the Germans have concluded an armistice with the Soviet Union and they're having to do a hard slog, the Allies are having to do a hard slog through the Mediterranean, would Roosevelt have turned to Churchill and said, right, well, Germany first is now going to be abandoned, and I'm going to turn the focus of my forces, instead of crossing the Atlantic, I'm going to put them in the Pacific. It won't just be the Marine Corps. and the Navy carrying the battle now in the Pacific. I want to, Japan attacked us. Germany hasn't actually attacked our sovereign territory. So we're going to switch to a Japan first policy, and we're going to wait and knock them out of the war, and then come back to Germany in our own sweet time.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I take that point, and I think that there are always voices led by Admiral King that should be, and MacArthur, that it should be Pacific first. That should be the case. But the fact of life is, Roosevelt and his political advisors were absolutely certain you always take out your strongest enemy first. Regardless of the geography, you take the strongest one out first, then you go to the other one. So I think we probably would have, I realise and I recognise the temptation there that Germany would have had to go first. I mean, quite interestingly, Japan was pressing at about the time of Kursk for the Germans and the Russians to come together, and actually have this armistice. So you've got all these other complications that are visible now in the Russian records that have been released. I think the issue here is essentially we've got this tactical action here in the East that has ripples that go out, but the ripples depend on what's going on elsewhere, to tell you the truth. That's the significant thing. How are people doing in Italy? It took a long time to get up through Italy, if you remember. Kesselring defended it really well with the troops that he had. But you've still got Germany dominating Western Europe if they stabilise the front in the east here. It's quite significant. As I said, I think D-Day would have happened, but not probably on the north coast of France.
John, just to pick up on your Pacific first point, I mean, I absolutely take what Chris says, which is that Roosevelt was always against it, and so probably wouldn't have happened even if there was a persuasive case for it. But let's just go with it. Let's just say they do switch to a Pacific first strategy. Does that mean that the victory over Japan is brought forward? Does that mean it's a victory over Japan in 1944?
Potentially. I mean, the big issue there, what would have happened to the A-bomb project?
Yeah.
Because the amount of resource that the United States had to put into the Manhattan Project was absolutely vast, and really, that expense of material and time and capacity was drawn by the fact that, having defeated Germany, Japan is still not willing to lay down arms, and the Americans look at, we have got to end this, and we've got to end this sooner or later. But of course, in a situation where the Americans aren't suffering the grind through Normandy and Western Europe, and they've really got holding forces operating in the Mediterranean, and as Chris said, not only being in fighting and slogging their way up Italy, but landing in southern France and taking over the Adriatic into Yugoslavia or Albania or whatever, pushing into Greece. So the Americans be able to switch the bulk of their forces to the Pacific. Would the Japanese be able to hold out as they did? Would America have had to do such an island hopping policy, or could they have done it another way and defeated the Japanese without the use of A-bombs by the end of 44?
If we've got this situation where we've switched to the Mediterranean here, look at the map of Europe. If you come up this way, you don't have an east-west with the Russians coming in that way, with us coming in from the west. You've got it coming up from the south. So how do these countries end up aligning once the war is over?
Well, this is a key point. What does Europe look like after the war if you've had an armistice between the Nazis and the Soviets?
I have to say, I think the Russians would have said, look, as part of this, we've got to go back to the 1939 borders.
Right.
That's the first thing. And as I said, I think Hitler would never have given up Ukraine. And his whole Lebensraum policy is in tatters here, because if you go back to 1939 borders, you've actually got Poland as half of Poland as well. So that's a bit difficult. But how far have we penetrated by that stage up into here? Because we're saying, because there's an interesting confrontation here going to happen, isn't there? Because if Germany does say, let's go back to the 1939 borders, we get it, but and we'll have this armistice, you're going to come up here, you're still fighting against Germany. How are you going to liberate Poland with the Russians sitting there on the bit that they've got? And how does the rest of this look in relation? Czechoslovakia, for example, comes west.
Well, then how does the Cold War play out then, if the borders are so different? Yeah,
absolutely. So you've got a bit of an issue there. Going back to John's point about the Pacific, by the end of 1943, you know that the Manhattan Project's going to work. So what you might say is we are going to stick with Germany first. And you know what? we'll just put the assaults in the Pacific on slow time, and we'll just wait for the bomb.
Do you think, I mean, that's a really interesting point. Just on the armistice between Hitler and Stalin, do you think that ever might have happened?
I think there are a lot of people on both sides thought that was the case. What's quite interesting, again, in Russia is they promote this League of German officers. All the captured German officers they've got, including the generals, are being primed to go and govern Germany after the end of the war. They've got together all the German communists, and there's this League of Free Germany that they set up. So they've got this idea that they can replace the regime at some stage. So that is a possibility as well. And it depends very much on them coming together and agreeing about the form of government. So that could have stopped not just after Kursk, but at any stage. Now, if Valkyrie had actually succeeded in July of 1944, and you ally that with what's going on in terms of negotiations between the Germans and the Russians, you've got a totally different complexion on the end of the war in the East. Again, I think it comes down to a lot of concessions in terms of land. It's the end of Hitler's Mittel Europa Lebensraum project, to tell you the truth. And of course, they lose Ukraine, Romania probably. But as I said, if you've got the Allies coming up from the Mediterranean, that line comes pretty much, takes in Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. They're not part of the Warsaw Treaty Organization afterwards. Hungary's the same. Poland's the doubtful one. That's the one that probably would have remained in the Soviet sphere.
I reckon we can probably say that had the Battle of Kursk been won by the Germans, which I think we're all in agreement, they could have won it had things played out differently. Some really significant long-term consequences could have followed. First of all, it shores up the Germans on the Eastern Front. And so as a result, do you get an armistice between Stalin and Hitler? If that happens, of course, it means that the Germans can focus their attentions to the West. That then probably has implications for the Allied landing at Normandy. D-Day doesn't happen, or certainly doesn't happen when it happened. Do you get the Allies completely changing their approach? So instead of having a Germany first policy, you have a Mediterranean first policy, and you have France being liberated from the south. What are the long-term consequences of that? Or even do you get a situation in which America decide, you know what, we're not going to focus on Europe first at all. We're going to focus on the Pacific first, potentially. Victory over Japan is established in 1944, but that, of course, is contingent on what's happening with the Manhattan Project. Do you need the atom bombs to be dropped in order for Japan to surrender? But also the Cold War. If the borders of Central Europe are fundamentally different as a result of an armistice between Russia and the Germans, how does the Cold War play out? How does the second half of the 20th century play out? Some really big consequences, all stemming from one battle in 1943. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Jonathan Trigg and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me, and we will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, on YouTube. And if you like this, why not subscribe to Times Radio's main channel, where you can also catch me presenting Frontline, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.